So the challenge, the throwdown is 11 o'clock service. If you run Bloomsday really fast, you can make it for the 11 o'clock service, right? Like, so we'll know, like you show up sweaty in your shirt, you'll like impress the rest of us. If you show up 15 minutes late, we'll consider that you're a little slow. If you show up at 5:30, you're a walker, right? Yeah. Or a watcher like Nick. By the way, he's skinny genetically. The man hates running, and therefore I hate him for that, right? Like, I have to run like 80 miles a week to be thin, and he's like, yeah, no, I look like a runner, I just am not at all, so. Yeah, I like the goals you set, though. I am never going to run Bloomsday, and I'm doing great with that. That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome, yeah. Yeah, it's a very attainable goal, yeah. I've been doing it wrong all these years. I did it really wrong last year. Last year I was crazy last year. Usually I try to run it twice every year. And I know that sounds insane, and it is. I usually try to run it. I come through the t-shirt line, and then usually Sherry and the girls are starting someplace, in the kind of like slower divisions, and they're moving through. And so I blaze the first lap. That's when you start calling Bloomsday by its laps, you know you're like sick in the head. So I blaze the first lap, and then I get my t-shirt, and then I run with my t-shirt, and I like show it to people as I'm going by. Spoiler alert, like, hey, this is what it looks like. See you in 2 hours, whatever. So I go run, and my goal is to always catch Sherry and the girls. And so last year, it was ridiculous because my girls are getting taller, so their legs are longer. They also decided to run, which in years past they walked. And so I went from thinking, I'm going to catch them before Latah Creek to maybe I'll catch them by the time we're at Life Center. And by the way, this whole time I'm running my first lap, no water, because if you drink water, you go slow. So I wanted to like crack my best time. And so no water. It was 70 degrees. I'm dying of thirst. And then I'm thinking, well, when I catch them, I can drink all the water I want. So I'm running the course, just like blazing, trying to find them. By the time I get in front of Life Center, I'm delirious. Angie, didn't I run into you? Yeah, I ran into Angie. Last service, I couldn't remember because I was delirious. I think she looked at me like, are you okay? And where's Sherry and the girls? Where are they? And I kept running. I just kept going, and I was out of control. I never drank any water, and I caught them, catch this, I caught them in front of the courthouse. Yeah, so those of you that have run Bloomsday, that's like with a quarter mile left. I like see my family like a mirage in the distance. I was like, there they are. Like, I'm going to make it, like most like normal people would have quit running and gone home. I was just like, no, I will do this, So they like dragged me across the finish line, and it's just, so I every now and then I make really bad decisions. I just make once in a while, these things, yeah. I buy shirts with pink on them, You look back and go, what was I thinking? Why did I buy a shirt with pink on it? Because last service, plenty of people, nice pink shirt, bro. Brenton, he liked it. He said, hey, he likes my shirt, so I'm cool like that. But we make decisions, and we make these decisions sometimes that we regret, and sometimes we make these decisions that we regret, like in the moment, we look back and we go, well, yeah, there was a day that was impacted, or there was maybe a moment that was impacted by a decision that we didn't really like. But then there are those moments when we make decisions and the implications are fairly catastrophic. You know what I mean? Like we make decisions and we go, like we look back. Like there's moments for me where you go, what was he thinking when he got that shirt? But then you have those moments when you like look back on your life and you go, like, what was I thinking when and then you just fill in the blank. Because whatever that decision was, the outcome from that decision resulted in chaos. It resulted in destruction. It resulted in emotional pain or physical pain, or there are financial implications. Like sometimes we make those kinds of decisions and we look back on our life and we think, what in the world was I thinking? Sherry and I had a season in our life, and not that we don't make these kinds of decisions, but we've made some fairly catastrophic decisions at moments in our life. And I remember one particular season where it seemed like every time we sat down together, like date night, 2 minutes after the kids went to bed, and we just had a moment to talk, like it just seemed like the bulk of our conversation was what we called the autopsy conversation, where we were looking at these certain decisions that we had made and the outcomes of those decisions, and all we could do, like all our conversation ever was what we should have done different. We should have changed this, should have this, why were we thinking this? And we just would we would go over, for months, we would go over and over these decisions and think, how did we do this? Anyone else ever, you autopsy bad decisions? Anyone else ever do this? Like just 3 people that make bad decisions? Thanks, yeah, great. You guys don't need me. See you later, you guys are good. No, we do this, right? We make these decisions, and in some way, what I wish we could have is some sort of template, some sort of anatomy of a bad decision, right? Like if there was an anatomy of a bad decision where we knew the makeup of all of these different choices, these roadblocks along the way, it'd be great because then we could come into the scenario, see what we were about to do, and go, wait a second, this looks like it's going to turn out bad. Like the anatomy of a bad decision would be really helpful for a lot of us if we actually knew what went into these catastrophic choices that we make. This morning, we're going to move into a story in the life of David that's really interesting because David, in many ways, kind of lays this out for us. The actions and our ability to kind of sit and watch how he behaves actually gives us a sort of anatomy for the bad decision. We actually get to see the process in the decision that he's about to make. And as we look at this, we're going to see David makes some choices that have catastrophic, devastating effects on people in his life, on himself. Like this is, in fact, it's so catastrophic. At one point, we considered changing the David graphic because the particular mistake he makes, that black band should probably move down to a lower portion of the David statue because David makes some decisions that are pretty surprising for a guy like him. So if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 11. And we're going to start reading this in verse 1. It says this: in the spring of the year, kind of like this time of year, in the spring of the year, when it should have been sunny and instead it was raining, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. This story kind of picks up with a really interesting detail. So David is in the springtime. Apparently that's the time that kings go to war. It's just the thing you do when you're a king. It's spring. Let's go fight people. So in the spring, when kings go to battle, it says David sent Joab. David remained in Jerusalem, and then there's this last little comment that's made here, this last little note that seems to indicate something's a little amiss with David and where he's at. There's something that's off because it says that David remained in Jerusalem. David didn't go. When kings do these things, David didn't do these things. So already we see David's beginning to behave in a particular way. And we're going to look at the story, and then we're going to unpack this. So David's staying home from Jerusalem. And then in verse 2 it says this: it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. So David's on his roof. He sees this woman. And then in verse 3, and David sent and inquired about the woman. David inquires about the woman. Do I need to explain what David's thinking when he says that he inquired about the... Everybody clear on what's going on with David? Like we know, we can keep this PG and just say David inquired about the woman. We know what's on his mind, right? David inquired about the woman. David inquires about her. Here's what's interesting about David inquiring about the woman. We kind of get this idea that David's like, hey, I saw this beautiful woman from the roof, and maybe somebody could tell me who she was. When this says that David inquired about the woman, it wasn't that kind of inquiry. The next verse kind of unpacks why. David is asking questions. What's David thinking? He's inquiring about the woman, but the response to his inquiry says that he wasn't asking what we maybe think he was asking, like, who is she? Because in verse 3 it says that one of his advisors said to him, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Is this not, like this woman, I mean, isn't this, the question isn't, oh, who is that? I want to know. And then the person says, oh, I'll tell you, that's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. That's not the answer to the question. The question is that David's inquiring about her. There's this vagueness to what David's inquiring, but the advisor's response is, wait a second. Wait, do you realize, David, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The fact that this little detail is given about Uriah the Hittite is even more telling, because Uriah the Hittite is somebody that David actually knew fairly well. Now, if you remember back in the early time of this series, when we were at the beginning of David's life, there was a season in which David was on the run from his father-in-law Saul, and he held up in a cave called Adullam. And it was in that cave that there were men that were drawn around David to fight with him, to support with him. There was this band of guerrilla fighters, and they actually deserved or earned a reputation. And that reputation, they were called, as a group of men, they were called David's mighty men. That was this group of people. Uriah the Hittite is one of David's mighty men. Uriah the Hittite is a guy that when David was a young man on the run, hiding in caves, Uriah the Hittite was one of the few individuals who gathered around David to support him, to fight for him, to protect him, to be with him in whatever he was doing. So Uriah the Hittite is a part of this band of brothers who have been with David from the very beginning. So when David inquires about Bathsheba, he's not wondering who she is. He knows the wife of his friend Uriah. And we can see that because this guy says, David, that's Bathsheba. That's Uriah's wife. David, verse 4, sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. And then it says, then she returned to her house. Do you realize what he's just done? He's taken the wife of one of his mighty men who is off at war where he should be, fighting his battles. He's taken his wife and he slept with her. This is unbelievable, right? Like you look at this and this is absolutely unbelievable. And now, as this story starts to unfold, things begin to get increasingly complicated. And that's something I think that we need to pause for just a moment and think about. And this is the way it frequently goes, is when we make bad decisions, when we make poor decisions, life frequently gets more complicated from our bad decisions, right? Like, when was the last time someone made a really bad decision and you heard them say, that was a really tough choice, but my life is a lot simpler now because of it? Right? Like, we don't ever say that. We don't ever go, man, that was a horrible decision, but man, life sure worked out better because of that. Like, that doesn't happen. We make bad decisions, whether they be relationally, financially, whatever the decisions are that we do. We make bad decisions and life gets more complicated. That's just the way it goes. Like, you've never ever made a decision that was bad and then walked away from it and thought, man, my life is better off because of that. You wouldn't call it a bad decision if that were the case, right? We make bad decisions and life gets messy. Suddenly we find ourselves cleaning up emotional damage. We find ourselves dealing with spiritual damage. We find ourselves dealing with physical realities, financial damage. Like, we make bad decisions and life always gets increasingly complicated as a result of those bad decisions, right? Like, can we all kind of nod and agree? Like, we all agree. Like, you make a bad choice, life gets complicated. This is how things work. David calls for her, he sleeps with her, he sends her home, and then guess what? It is going to get more complicated. It always does. It never gets less complicated when we make bad decisions. And so in verse 5, we see what happens. It says that the woman conceived. Talk about complication, right? She conceived and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. Hashtag complicated, right? Selfie, pregnant belly, right? Complicated, right? Like, this is the definition of complicated, right? Like, oh, now what, right? So what do we do when things get complicated? This is what we do. Like, if step 1 is make a bad decision and complicate things, step 2 for us as human beings, I love this, by the way, about David here, because a lot of this series, David makes these choices and it challenges me. And I've talked to other people where it's like been just in time kind of stuff. Like, we talk about something and David responds a way none of us ever would. And then this next week, and this has happened to me where something comes up in my life and I'm like, now I got to practice what I preach. literally, like that's really awkward when you're the preacher. I love this next story because this is the one time David does what we do, right? Step 1, make a bad decision that complicates your life. Step 2, this is how we always do it. Step 2, make another bad decision to try to cover up what we did to further complicate our life, right? Like, let's just exponentially make this more complicated. That's just the way we roll with things, don't we? Like, we mess up and we go, oh man, I can fix this. Whenever you hear somebody say, no, you're not about to fix it. You're about to make it more complicated, right? Like, we make messes. I remember years ago, and some of you, I'm going to confess something that might disappoint a few of you, okay? Like 10 years ago, I bought a minivan. Yeah, and I had vowed I never would. Like, I told myself, I'm never going to be that guy, I'm never going to buy a minivan. In fact, my friend Matt, after the last service, came up to me. He goes, do you remember trying to convince me to buy a minivan because you didn't want to be alone in owning a minivan? It's like, yeah, no, I'm sorry, okay? Complicated. My life's still complicated from that bad decision. So I'm driving around the minivan, I tried to call it the man van for a while. That didn't stick. Like, just all these things. So I remember I built a case against the minivan. Like, guys, ladies, just so you know, your husbands, when they start to dislike a car, they will build a case against that car, right? Like, every repair costs 3 times as much as it really does. It's just, it's so expensive and it's complicated, right? It's just that car. We need to unload it. So I just decided, you know what, I'm done. So I get this phone call from a friend who works at a car dealership over in Post Falls that's going out of business. And he says to me, car dealer, remember this, he says to me, I think I can get you a really good deal on a car. And I was like, man, I don't care if it's a good deal or not. I want out of this stupid, minivan that I'm driving. And so, by the way, sorry to all you guys driving minivans. Don't send emails. Because you can't prove to me that it's cool. You can't. You can try, but you can't. So anyways, I go over, and this guy, it's a Suzuki dealership, right? And I buy for my family of 5 a little Suzuki 5-passenger wagon. And I take it home to my wife. Here you go, babe, what do you think? Like, problem solved, right? Like, there's something wrong with you when you're replacing a minivan with a Suzuki wagon, right? Like, there's something broken in my thinking. So we tried jamming all 3 kids in this car, which at that point in time all had boosters or car seats. Right? So this is genius of me. Didn't think about that until the ride home. And so now I'm driving this car, and my wife's driving. She's like, this is horrible. We don't fit. You're right. I remember one time we were at a park and trying to jam bikes in the back of it and on the roof. We just looked like, it was horrible, right? So I finally decided this was a really bad decision. Now, my friend who was working at the dealership that closed went to go work at another dealership. Note to self, if they don't run a good business at one place, what makes you think they will somewhere else? I don't know, right? So I go to this other place and here's what I decide. I decide if I get a good enough deal on another car that's more expensive, I can absorb the loss of this car in it, right? And then we can just kind of some of you guys are like, oh, dude, you're speaking my language, right? So I'm going to just kind of shuffle things around. The deal is I shouldn't have bought a car to begin with the first time. Now I'm spending more money on a second car, right? Replacing this one, trading it in after a few short weeks. This is always good financial decision, by the way. Do not do as I do, right? And check this out. My wife hates red cars. I trade in a Suzuki wagon for a fire engine red Suburban. Like, complicated. Like, what are you thinking, right? Way more expensive. I look back and go, that minivan was awesome. Like, the best decision I ever made was the minivan, right? Because we do this. Like, we make a bad decision, and then we make another decision. Like, we just try to fix this stuff, and we further complicate. And some of you right now are like, man, you're explaining my life to me, right? Like, I live here all the time. Like, we do this sort of thing. David is making things more complicated. In verse 6, it says, David sent word to Joab, his commander, who's out in the field, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. Before you think that David's about to do the honorable thing, let's keep reading. Check this out. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing, which, by the way, this should be like David's clue phone going off, right? You just sent word to Joab to send Uriah, and then he says, hey, by the way, how's Joab doing? weren't you guys just in correspondence with each other? This is weird. Like, he asked him how Joab was doing and how the people were doing. How's stuff going up there at the war where I should be? Like, food good? Like, how, they're just making small talk. And then it says, verse 8, that David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And there's some implications with what he's saying. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. And so basically what David does is he just brings Uriah in for a chat. Hey, I just want to talk to you. Give me an update. We've been friends for years. We've been fighting battles. How's stuff going up at the front? Oh, okay, great. Okay, now that we're done, hey, why don't you head home? Go wash your feet. Go head home. And what's David doing? David's hoping that Uriah goes and sleeps with his own wife, and then everyone will assume that Bathsheba is pregnant with his child, and no one will ever wonder why. Like, we will get out of this thing. Like, we'll be clear. It'll just be our secret. This will be it, right? Great plan, except it doesn't work. Because in verse 9 it says this, but Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all of the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. He didn't go home. Sleeps at David's door. And the reason that he doesn't go home, it'll make you like Uriah even more and make you hate David even more. Because look at what happens in verse 10. It says that when they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house. Like, everybody was like, what are you doing, bro? We already know your wife's pretty. You've been away at battle. Why didn't you go home? So, like, what are you doing? Like, why didn't you go home? David said to Uriah, have you not come home from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. I'm a part of a band of brothers. I would never do this with them out there fighting battles and sleeping in the open and in this position of vulnerability. I would never let my guard down. Right, this is, like, at this point, David should probably look at the honor of this man and take a lesson from him. David instead decides to try again, and so he says, hang out another night, I'll send you home tomorrow. In the meantime, I want you to eat a good meal. And then David gets him drunk. Literally, the text says in the next few verses that David gets him drunk, and what's even more amazing from this text is that it says that Uriah slept on the couch, right? Like, he got so drunk, he slept on the couch at David's house. And so David wakes up in the morning and he realizes, like, you didn't go. I can't believe this. And then in these next verses, we see David take this to a whole new level. Verse 14 says, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. I want you to pick this up. David writes a letter to Joab. He seals it. He gives it to Uriah, and he says, take this to Joab. He writes a letter and sends it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter, he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. This guy is so honorable towards David that he has this letter that is carrying his own death sentence, and he doesn't open it. He has enough respect for the king and his relationship with his commander that he keeps it closed, and he doesn't even understand that in that letter he's being deceived, he's being undercut. His demise is planned in these pages, and he carries it to Joab. I mean, does this look insane to anyone else? Like, you think about this. David is sending this guy to his death to cover up his bad decision. It's like, I mean, at what point does a person say, man, I've really messed up, so I probably ought to kill somebody and make sure no one finds out? There's like this trickle-down effect of this. But what's really insane, what's really nutty about this whole thing is that we can look at this from a distance and we see this story and we go, this is not rational behavior. This is not right. And what's really insane about this is that we do this same kind of thing all the time in all kinds of areas of our life. where we make these decisions that are followed by decisions that are followed by decisions, and it's so plain for everybody to see, but when we're caught in the moment, I used to have this professor in college that used to say, when you're in sin, you're insane. Right? There's like this temporary insanity that comes over you where you just don't see the error of your ways. There's this moment of insanity for David, but it's really an example of the moments of insanity that we experience. We do this stuff all the time, or we make bad choice after bad choice, and we fail to see the insanity of what we're doing. Verse 16 says that as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men from this other city, like men that were going to fight hard. And the men of that city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. And then Joab sent and told David the news about the fighting. And then in verse 26 it says that when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, when the season for her, which probably lasted a pretty extensive time of grieving the loss of her husband, when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And then, as if to hint at what happens next, and right when you think, did David get away with this? There's this last part of verse 27 that says, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And what did David do? Just started checking 10 commandments off, right? I'm just going to try to break them all. Like, covet your neighbor's wife, right? Like, commit adultery. I'm going to just, like, he's just checking them off. I'm going to kill somebody while I'm at it. You know, I might as well steal his car. I mean, like David is just like, this is so broken, isn't it? Like, you look at this, and this is so unbelievable to look at this. Like, you realize, like, the Lord's displeased. Well, yeah, we would be too. We look at it and we go, can you believe this? Like, this is insanity. And what's insane about this, what's really crazy, what's really challenging for me is that this is David, who is known for what? A man after God's own heart. That's the part of this that's so complicated for me to think about, that this is David, who is known before and after this, who's known in history as the man after God's own heart. This is David, the guy that wrote the Psalms, right? This is King David. This is God's guy. I mean, he wrote things like this. Psalm chapter 40, verse 8, just one example of the kind of things that David wrote. He said, I delight to do your will, O God. Like, I find joy in doing what you have for me. Like, your law is within my heart. That's not something that David just wrote because he thought it sounded good or rhymed. It really doesn't. That's what he felt, right? He felt these things. He believed these things. And this is the question we have to ask. How does somebody be a man after God's own heart? How does somebody believe these sorts of things and feel these sorts of things towards God and his ways? How does somebody believe that and then act like this? But that's a question we have to ask ourselves, right? How is it that we believe certain things? How is it that we dedicate how is it that we can be passionate? We can in so many conversations be 100% on, and then we have these moments when through impulse or emotion we blow past everything we believe to be true. How does it happen? There's something really wrong with this story, and at the same time, at a very deep level, there's something that's very good about us having to see this and look into this. Because we ask these questions. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, aren't there times when you just go, man, why did I do that? Why? Like, why did I say what I said? Why did I do it? I mean, what was going on? Like, don't we ask these questions? Like, we have stories. Maybe we didn't kill anybody. Hopefully we didn't kill anybody. But don't we have these stories, and there's this catastrophic cascade of events that have taken place. There's destruction, and we look and we go, what was I thinking? Like, if somebody could show me the anatomy of this bad decision, like, what was going on inside of me? Like, how does this happen? How did my life get complicated? How did I ever get here? there's this idea that's leaked into Western thought, Western thinking. And it's how a lot of us think. It's how a lot of us process these sorts of things. In the Western mind, what has grown to be the popular opinion among us, people that think like we do, is that for good people to behave badly, something bad must have happened to those good people. Like the conclusion that we draw, the reason that somebody would do these sorts of things is because we draw this conclusion that something, like we look at their past, their story, and we say, for a good person to behave so badly, that good person must have had something bad done to them. That's how we explain things. You think about stuff that pops up in the news, tragedies that take place, atrocities that people commit. Usually the first thing that we do is we start digging in their past, right? Because we want to explain this. We need to find the spot in their story where this person had something bad happen to them that would explain why they behaved this sort of way. And so we always go back and we flash the old pictures and the things, and they put the scary images, and everyone goes, well, no wonder they did this, right? The problem with that is that it only works some of the time, because for most of us, we have stories in our families and we have stories in our friendships. We have stories that are closer to home where people do things, right? They behave a particular way. They act out. They respond impulsively. They commit atrocities relationally. They do these things, and we scratch our heads and we go, why did they do that? It's even more troubling when it's somebody that's in our own family. Like we look at our family trees and we go, wait a second, we grew up in the same house. We grew up with the same parents. We drove the same old beat-up car, right? Like our lives were similar, and how in the world is it possible with my story and your story coming out of the same story that you could act and behave that way and I would? Like what is it? See, that's what happens. Sometimes there is no explanation. Have you ever noticed that the stories that stick around, the violent stories that stick around, are those stories that we actually have something to hang on to? But what about those times when that kid acts out, does something, it makes the news, and there really is nothing? We quit hearing about it, don't we? Like we look and it's like, well, he grew up in a really good house. His parents were great people. It was suburbia. He had a good education. Like something just happened. He just snapped. And we don't keep hearing those stories. Why? Because it doesn't fit with our paradigm. We think that for good people to do bad things, something bad must have happened to those good people, and yet that isn't always the case. You know, the FDR responded slowly to the Holocaust, and after World War II was over, do you know what he said? Do you know the reason that he gave for his slow response? He didn't believe that out of such a civilized, cultured society such as the German culture that produced Bach and Mozart, that out of that culture such atrocities could be possible. I didn't believe that human beings were capable of such things. The only reason good people do bad things is when bad things happen to good people. And yet we look at this story and we say, what is there? What indication is there in David's story that says there's a reason for him to do these things? For that matter, look at the other stories of the Bible. Look at Abraham, who when he goes to Egypt tells blatant lies. Look at Jacob, who is a deceiver, who comes and tricks his own family members to get what he wants, right? Like you think about these individuals. Peter, who denies Jesus 3 times. Like these are individuals where there's nothing in their story to explain this. There's just brokenness. There's just these decisions that take place where they completely violate everything that they believe. See, we deny this fundamental reality of being human that David's story reminds us of. What does this teach us? What does this tell us about the anatomy of a bad decision? I know for some of us, we want to look at the anatomy of a bad decision. We want a list. Let's just start where David started. Like, he should have gone off to war. And so, guys, we need to fight more. Just plain and simple. Like, don't sit on the couch. Go fight, right? Let's make a list. Let's get some rules, right? He shouldn't have gone on the roof. So don't go on the roof, right? Just a good general rule. You'll wreck the shingles. You might slip and fall, or you might see Bathsheba. So, guys, as a general rule, don't hang out on roofs, right? So let's make some rules for this thing, right? Let's take this apart. Let's look at the anatomy of this, right? Like, there's one thing that this story teaches that is head and shoulders above everything else. We aren't just broken people. We are individuals. We're people. And what this story tells us is that these things are in us. These things are like this acorn, this seed. We have the seed of these things, the seeds of destructive behavior, the seeds of terrible atrocities. We have the seeds of these things in every human heart, even human hearts that have drawn near to God, even people that are radically aligned with God, like David, Abraham, Jacob, Peter, like whoever. Like we have the seeds of these destructive behaviors inside of us. That's the fundamental principle of this story. These seeds, these things are in your heart. They're in my heart. That's the reality. Now, why do we deny this? Why does Western culture deny the reality of there being something like sin inside of us? Why do we reject this? We reject it for the same reason that we reject the power of this seed, of this acorn. I remember being a kid, and like learning about seeds, and somebody telling me that this acorn produced an oak tree. And the utter ridiculousness of that. Like, that was unbelievable, right? Like, you're kidding me, right? Like oak trees, like big, strong oak trees. You're telling me they come from this, right? There's this thing, and we question the power because we look at this and think, what power does this have? And yet somehow this thing gets planted, like it falls on the ground, and if the soil and the conditions around it are right, and if it gets watered, then it begins to grow, and it begins to sprout, and it begins to produce life. And as we see it producing life, it gets hopefully some sunlight, right? And then the sunlight helps that grow. And as that grows and matures, what does it do? Eventually, that tree becomes this strong oak that produces more seeds. And the more seeds fall, the more trees get planted, and pretty soon we have this forest. It's established. David has this seed. He stays home from war. He goes up on the roof. He inquires. He takes. And pretty soon, there's this oak tree in the middle of his life. There's this thing. The seeds of destructive behavior are in us. It all starts with this. David didn't do this because something happened to him. David did this because this is true. And the moment that you deny the reality of the power of these things, the moment that you began to start to dismiss these things as insignificant or meaningless or no big, that's when those things begin to take root in your life. The British theologian John Owen, 1700s or 1800s, said this. He said, "Be killing sin, or sin will be killing you." Because there's this seed that's there. What's easier, squashing an acorn or cutting down an oak tree? What would you rather deal with? This or an oak tree of a mess in your life? I just wonder, are we fully aware of the power of these things in our life? Are we fully aware of these things that are planted inside of us? Are we cognizant of the control that they have, the devastation that they can? Do we know these things? Like, this is David. This is a man after God's own heart, and he's susceptible. What does that say about you and I? What does that say about us if these things are there? And so the question is, what are we tolerating? What are the things in your life that you're tolerating and you say, I'm just kind of letting that go? Like, is there anything around, like in your life, where you just look and go, it's really not that big of a deal? Like, what are you okay with? And it's this seed that's just hanging around. You're like, it's not that big of an issue. You think it's harmless. It's not. What is it? I mean, in this story, it's sexuality. In this story, it's sexuality. And can I just pause for a second and say, sexuality in our culture today, it is ripping people's lives apart. Sexuality unchecked is destroying our culture. It's destroying our kids and family. Like, sexuality is one of the biggest lies in our culture today. Our culture is constantly telling us over and over and over again in every possible way, it's not that big a deal. Don't worry about it. The effects aren't that bad. And we just keep hammering this over and over, and we watch these stories, we hear the stories, and everybody's telling us that it's not that big a deal. And yet when you sit down with individuals one-on-one and you look at the catastrophic damage that's in their life, over and over again, people trace their stories to unchecked sexuality. And they say, I never realized, I never understood that one decision, that little thing would play out in so many areas of my life, right? For David, it's sexuality. It's this. And I got to say, our attitudes towards sexuality in our culture, can I just say, like, they are complicating our lives. Like, nobody's looking at our culture's approach to sexuality and saying, wow, isn't life better and more simple because of how we approach sexuality? Anybody heard that lately? But this is really working. No, right? No one's saying that. No real person, people on screens maybe, but no real person is saying that. Why? Because we don't want to admit the power of this seed that's planted inside of us. Some of you maybe say, okay, well, sexuality is not my issue. What is the issue? What is the issue? What is that thing that's inside of you? Is there this constant desire for more? Is there this sense of materialism, this desire, and you keep justifying this purchase, this thing, that thing. You keep consuming, and you keep saying, well, it's not as bad as, or whatever else it might be. Do you understand the power of that thing in your life to consume you, to root things, to plant things that you just can't get out? Is it jealousy? Is it judgment? Do you find yourself judging other people? Do you find yourself gossiping? Do you find yourself evaluating the hearts, the motives, the thoughts of other people? And maybe you only talk about them with a few friends, and so a little gossip isn't that big of a deal. But do you realize the potential of those things in your life? Like, we're having conversations, we have fantasies, we have emotions, we have attitudes, we have goals and objectives that we justify and look at. And in all of our justifying and all of our consideration and pursuit of those things, we're denying the power of those things to potentially wreck us, to become idols that destroy us. David, a man after God's own heart, ends up in this catastrophic, destructive situation. It is easier to squash an acorn than to cut down an oak tree. Some of you guys are like, I just want a reason to use my chainsaw. Right? Not in this circumstance, you don't. I love how this story deals with the misconceptions that so many of us have about God in the Bible. We have these misconceptions about God. We have these misconceptions about the Bible, like the point of this story. And I know some of you, like, you hear this, like, Brad's talking about sin and the power and these seasons, and like, here we go again. This is some sort of crazy religious talk about how if you just, do all the right things, then God will bless you, and then he'll take you to heaven someday. But what I love about this story is that it addresses those misconceptions that we have about God in the Bible. These misconceptions that's the story. That's not the point of the Bible or the heart of God, and this story makes that painstakingly clear. A couple of things about that. I mean, you read a story like this, and this is kind of a side note, but you read a story like this about David, a man after God's own heart, and these are his circumstances. You can't help but see that God continually and consistently works with people and extends grace to people who don't deserve it. Aren't you thankful for that? Like, you look at this and you go, okay, there's a different story being told because this is a man after God's own heart, and this is a grievous moment, and yet God is going to extend grace in this moment, right? I mean, the best people who ever lived can't overcome their flaws, and yet the grace of God continually overcomes their sinfulness. Like, that's unbelievable. But the other thing that's just so evident here, and what's so clear, and you can't help but take this away from the story, is the brokenness. It's the drama. It's the devastation to people's lives. I love this story because it just points it out. I mean, so many times we go, man, is God just trying to keep me from having fun? Is God just, you don't want me to live a full life. You don't want me to enjoy life. No, I love this story because suddenly all of those things where God's saying, please, please don't. All of those moments get put in perspective when you see it all play out and you go, no. This isn't God, the cosmic killjoy. This is God who's looking at our circumstances and saying, please don't. Please don't. You don't want your life to be this complicated. I love that about this because suddenly those things God encourages me to squash. They make a whole lot more sense, don't they? Suddenly the emotions that just have me right on the edge of overriding whatever thing I'm about to impulsively do, suddenly you look at this story and you go, man, I am so grateful for a God who shows me this so that I know what happens if I start watering. Not only does God care about us living a life that is redeemed, a life that is free of these catastrophic, destructive things, we have a God who's given us the power over them. That Jesus has come and he has conquered sin and death. And he has given us the power, the ability to squash this. You and I have the ability, whatever that thing is in our life, you and I have the ability to snuff it out, to not let it take root, to not let it wreck our stories. That's what God's given us.